episode 3 of Soap Bubble TV. The last episode is a week ago. I got a little bit lost in the global pandemic existential crisis, but I'm back today and we're going to blow some bubbles and we're going to learn some fun science and some fun bubbles. It's going to be really cool. Today we're going to learn something very interesting called minimal surface area. Woo! Really fun stuff. Our last lesson was all about surface tension, and surface tension, wonderful quick little recap, is a very gentle force that always pulls the bubbles, the molecules always pulling inwards, they're always trying to eat like that, nice and tight surface tension. And this week we're going to learn about what surface tension gives us, which is called minimal surface area, which is a very, very interesting little property of bubbles. It's got very big applications in mathematics and science and architecture. Woo! And so we're going to look at that. So let's jump right into it. So the term minimal surface and area. So minimal, the least amount, surface, like the surface, and an area. So the easiest way to look at minimal surface area is, hey, what do you know? A bubble. You see? Remember, our surface tension is what makes the soap from water go into a sphere. It stretches out because it's like elastic, you know, it gives us a little bit of elasticity. Ooh. And it pulls into a sphere. For the same reason that a water drop, like rain, goes into a little water drop, like a little sphere. Because a minimal surface area, surface tension is pulling it in, pulling in, and it goes into a sphere. Why? Because a sphere has the least amount of surface for the amount of volume inside. The volume being the air inside, the surface being the bubble. Because it takes some work and energy to keep this bubble maintained. And if it was in like a funny irregular shape, then it would be using a lot more energy to hold that shape. So it goes to the least amount of energy, that it's least amount of work required, which is a sphere. Very, very interesting. And it's because, so it's doing the least, getting the most. Doing the least, getting the most. It's economizing. Very, very important. It's what we're always trying to do. It's what nature's trying to do. Never doesn't want to waste energy. Wants to be as efficient and economize as much as possible. And that is the key to minimal surface area. So do not want to waste. And so that's all well and good with a sphere. Okay, yes, a sphere, it's the minimal surface area shape. It's got the least amount of surface for the amount of volume inside. But what happens if we have if we have 2, 3, 4, or a million bubbles? Will they still make a sphere? No. So there's our one bubble. And see, now if I have 2 bubbles the same size, they will have just a flat wall between them. See that? It's flat. You know what they're doing? They are sharing. That is what they're doing. They are sharing their bubble walls now. See, they would have that kind of curve, but it's like these two, they don't have that curve. It's like they've gone a little shortcut and they've cut from like there, and they have that. But what they have is these 2 bubbles, these 2 volumes, they have the same amount of air they would have if they were a sphere, but they have less surface area. Ooh. So the same amount of, it's going to pop soon as well, the same amount of air but less bubble. So that means they're working, they have to do less work, but they get the same result. And that's key. That is what minimal surface area is so good for. That's why we like it, because it's minimizing the amount of effort. It's being efficient, it's economizing. Okay, that's the key principle. And that's why, and it's because of that property, that's why we've learned so much from the bubble, because, you know, we want to get the most for doing the least. And nature is always doing this. Nature doesn't like to waste energy. Nature is always as efficient as possible. And so it minimizes. So let's take a look. That was 2. Now let's take a look at 3 bubbles. 2, and 3. Now you see here, this is really interesting. Now we have, you see that like trifecta, it's splitting off there. The 3 bubbles are joining in like a trifecta. And the angle of that there is 120 degrees, okay? If you imagine 360, you know, like a whole circle, or a sphere, we've cut it now by 3. Divide by 3, you get 120. Divided by 2, like earlier, we had 180, which was the flat wall. Now it's 3, the 120. And there's a lot we can and have learned from that 120. Let's get that back quickly. There's a lot we've learned from this, from building roads to many other examples. And you'll find this 120 in many examples in nature. You'll find, just like most common obviously is bees. When you see a bee's hive, it's all made of hexagons. You see all the little hexagons all around a beehive. The angle of a beehive for each individual of a hexagon is 120 degrees. And it's the same when you see cracks, or like how many rocks break. If you really look at their angle, quite often it'll be, if not close, to 120 degrees. Nature's not perfect, doesn't always get it. It's always striving for perfection, but sometimes not. The Giant's Causeway, for example, is a very, very beautiful example in Ireland, all the beautiful hexagonal rocks. And there's quite a few hexagonal rocks around the world. And cracks, like in your glass. If you ever see your glass, like a glass is cracked, take a look. It often split off in that 120. And it's the same with trees and many plants and flowers. They'll stem off in that 120 degrees. The biggest application for this in industrial use, in industries, is it's called the motorway problem. And the motorway problem is, if you had multiple towns, what would be the best way to connect them with roads? What would be the best structure of roads? Okay, obviously roads are very expensive. It takes quite a lot to make them. You don't want to have the maximum amount of roads, you want the minimum amount of roads, but you also want them to efficiently connect them from each town. Imagine you have 4 towns like that. So you could do some mathematics for this and many equations, and take in all the sorts of distances and measurements and things like that. Or you could blow some bubbles and you would see the minimal amount of road required to connect those 4 towns efficiently, so it's equal in distance for all of them, and it's efficient. That is basically, and that is because we have minimal bubbles on minimal surface area. We're looking at a minimal surface, the surface area, which is the road, and we want the minimal amount of it. So bubbles really help with that. It's called the motorway problem. Let's take a look now. Bubbles join in 2 angles. It's not just 120 degrees. When you have 3 bubbles, they will join at 120 degrees. But when you had 4 bubbles, it's a little bit different. And there is a law about this. It's the Plateau's law. Plateau. It's a French name. It's got like 3 vowels. Plateau. I never know if I say it correctly. Okay. There's 1. 2. 3. So we've got 120. Back again, always the same. Okay, and now we have 4 bubbles joining. Now, obviously on the outside, we have 3 bubbles joining, but in the middle, you can look in there, we actually have all 4 touching together. They are now joining, not at 120, but 109 degrees, 28 minutes, and 16 seconds. See, it's joining like that, it's joining like that, it's joining that way, and that way. It's 4 lines, and all of those angles there are 109 degrees, 28 minutes, and 16 seconds. Now, what is 28 minutes and 16 seconds? They use minutes and seconds between degrees. So between 1 and 2, you would use minutes and seconds for those little integers between them. Okay. And Plateau said that 4 bubbles would always join at 109 degrees, 3 minutes 9 seconds, and 3 bubbles would always join at 120 degrees. Why are they doing this? Why 120? Why 109? These are very good angles to join. Why are these the best angles? Why do bubbles always join? They're very good angles. They're golden angles. They're very equal. They're very well distributed. As in 3 would be 120, and that makes up the hexagon. And also 109 is the angle of a pentagon. And so, well, 109, 108 is like between. And you will find hexagons and pentagons all over our natural world, especially in the finer forms such as crystals. Crystals will very often be either a hexagon or a pentagon, and crystals, as we know, are really refined structures, really the finest, and so they again too are minimizing because they're just so fine, those crystal structures. You also find squares and cubes and things, but it's predominantly pentagons and hexagons, and these are very strong, stable shapes, and therefore, because they're sharing at these angles, the energy will be distributed equally. It will be efficient, it will be stronger than it would be a more kind of random number. If they were all joining at their own random number, it would be very different. Now, let's take a look at, that's if we had 1 or 3 or 4 bubbles. And the thing is, as we said with plateaus, well, they always join at those angles, even with foam. This over here, all these bubbles over here are joining at either 109 or 120 degrees. Okay, wow. And here we have thousands of bubbles all joining. And they're all joining at 109. Over there they'll be joining at 109. On the outside here they'll be joining at 120 degrees. Or 109 as well. And bubbles in here, they'll pop. But the bubble, as soon as a bubble pops, the bubbles will adjust. And they'll move and they'll find new angles, new ways, because they're always minimizing their surface area. They won't stay the same irregular shape. Their forces, the surface tension, like we learned last time, is always pulling it in. It's always pulling. And so if something pops in, it balances out the forces, and it minimizes as much as it possibly can. And this is very, very useful because it's using the least amount of energy for the given structure, for the amount of volume it's holding, for the structure that it's holding. It's not wasting energy. And who wants to waste energy? You always want to do the least amount of work to get the maximum result. You don't want to do the most amount of work to get the minimum result. You want to be efficient, and that's where this pattern over here has become very useful in architecture. They built buildings out of soap bubbles. And this has actually got a fun little history. Is back in the 1800s, in 1889, Lord Kelvin, great physicist of our age, posed the question. It's called the Kelvin problem. What is the most efficient soap bubble substructure? Because soap bubbles are minimal surface area shapes. What would be the most efficient structure or pattern we could make out of this. That would be the most efficient shape. And this is very interesting because you'll find this in like sea urchins in life, you'll find it in crystals. A lot of sea life follows these patterns, and we're basically trying to find the minimum amount of energy in a structure. And he posed a model, and Kelvin cell, and it took over 100 years until two physicists in Ireland, Vira and Phelan, don't know their first names, Dennis Vira, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Vira, Wera, that's it, Wera, the Wera-Phelan, it's the Wera-Phelan structure. They posed two shapes together that create their structure, and they found that this had a greater minimal surface area. So it was 120 years until, over 100 years until they found a structure that was more efficient, and the applications of this knowledge is very, very, very powerful, because these structures, like I said, they mimic sea creatures, they mimic cell structure, but they also, you know, it's architecture, it's building, whether it's building really fine fibers or whether it's building massive buildings like the water cube in Beijing, which is basically a giant Wera and Phelan structure. They built the water cube, this Olympic building, it's gorgeous, just out of this pattern, the most efficient soap bubble sud pattern. Because they used the most efficient soap bubble pattern, the structure was stable within itself. It didn't need any kind of external beams or cables to kind of keep it strong. They didn't need any and they could use lighter material to create this structure, because the structure itself, the blueprint, was so stable and so strong, because we learnt it from nature, we learnt it from bubbles, and they know all about it. And so because they could use lighter materials, these lighter materials were much better for thermal and holding in the heating, and that saved a lot of money and a lot of energy, just because we built the building using bubbles. And I think that's amazing. I think it's great. It's learning from nature. Nature is our best teacher by far, and these kind of findings and understandings are useful in everything, from how we create materials to how we create buildings to Lord knows, you know, I mean the circus tent is a minimal surface area structure, and I mean, look how much fun that is. And so that's minimal surface area. It's a very fascinating kind of geometric quality. And we've got lesson 5, which will be all about platonic solids, which is like another a deeper look into this geometry. Now we're actually going to start the kind of the bubble part, and I'm going to show you guys how to make some bubbles. But to recap and summarize, minimal surface area, the bubbles are always economizing, they're always trying to be as efficient as possible, so they're sharing with other bubbles and creating all sorts of structures and shapes, always to minimize the surface area, so that they get the most, they do the least. That is real economy in a sense. And that's minimal surface area. We should have a minimal surface area government, minimal surface area country, minimal surface area, minimal resource use, and we can learn it all from the bubble. And so let's begin the bubble part. Recording 22 minutes. Alright, quite a long episode. So obviously the first one you just saw, I have a straw over here and into a container, and just don't breathe in, breathe out, don't suck in. I mean, don't drink it like straw. And you can have yourself a lovely, and you can really come up nice and close, look at all the wonderful patterns, and you can see the iridescence in it. It's really, really pretty, just like that. But our main prop and build today, we're going to be building things, is you're going to take your bottle top, cut it off like that if you haven't got one of these already from the previous episodes, and then you're going to take a sock and an elastic band. And what we are going to do is we're going to wrap our sock around the edge of the end. Let's take a look. Careful not to cut yourself. And safety, saving the world. Okay, now the key with this prop, it has to be taut. You want that to be as tight as possible. Taut. Taut. I find that word so amusing. So we're going to put an elastic on. If you don't have an elastic, that's fine. Just like hold it like nice and tight like that. Or you can use some string, or you can wrap the sock around very tight like that. That's what you want, and then just give it another little tug like that, extra taut. And then you're going to take that and you can just dip this in. It can just be soapy water. It really doesn't have to be any specific bubble kind of recipe for this. And you can make this beautiful, beautiful chain of bubbles like that, and it'll have these amazing shapes and colors in it. It's kind of like a, you can almost imagine it like DNA, you know, like this whole intelligent pattern of energy. And there's so much you can do with this over here. And you can blow it up in the sky, and you'll notice slowly but surely it gets lighter and lighter. You can, a lot of kids really enjoy, I just put it on their hand. They really enjoy that, but you can also kind of make jewelry out of it. I don't know why kids really enjoy this. And wrap around their hand like that, nice and stylish, authentic, natural, homemade kind of jewelry. You put it on the hair. My favorite activity really is actually just, it's like cloud ball basically. You just kind of get a little bit like that, and you just air it in the sky. And yes, you can play this with a friend. You can just pass it, you know, to the other. Just fan underneath the bubble, or you can even use like actual, you know, kind of like a pan. Oh, and it turns into multiple. I'm having a good time now. Oh, it's caught. And yes, you can play the game with your friend. Obviously, if you have a child, something to help them create wind really helps, like a fan or a plate. Okay, that's stuck up there now. You can also make hats. You know, you just get like a child's head, and you just, and then, you know, they got a kind of people will laugh at them, they'll laugh at themselves, it'll be funny. Try not to get it in their eyes because it can sting. If you want to really do like a big bubble hat kind of time, because you can, like do haircuts. Really stylize it, if you're going to do it on your head a lot, you can use just shampoo and water, and then this over here won't sting your eyes as much because shampoo, it's meant to kind of go on your head. Fairy liquid and soap, dishwashing liquid is not. And yeah, basically I'm not going to show you a million things you can do with this because there's so many you can just do just by playing around. It's a very simple thing, but you can do it in many different ways. It changes how quick you blow. See how far you can get. You can make yourself a lovely kind of necklace like that, or you can just play with your kind of snake vibe. I don't know, do whatever you want really. I mean, there's so much you can do with this. And make it into a puppet, or like I said, you can just wave it high in the end, play with a cloud, or you can make loads of bubbles. You blow it really hard, and then you can have like tiny bubbles everywhere. Play around. Very simple, very fun, and you can understand the universe with it too. So I hope everyone's enjoyed the lesson. We'll be doing 2 more lessons. The next one will be about color of a bubble. We'll study the beautiful iridescent patterns and understand what it is we're looking at. And the final episode is going to be about platonic solids, which is a really cool study of bubbles and geometry. And so, goodbye everyone. Goodbye. I hope